Why is it that even when we grow older, even when life has filled us with responsibilities, deadlines, and bills to pay, a simple fairy tale can still stir our hearts? Why is it that a story we once heard as children, under the warm glow of a bedside lamp, can still make us pause, smile, or even shed a quiet tear? Somewhere in that familiar rhythm of once upon a time, something timeless calls to us. We may remember the sound of a parent's voice or the way we felt curled up under a blanket, listening as princes, witches, dragons, and princesses danced vividly in our imagination. And yet, Carl Jung would tell us that what we recall is not only a memory of childhood innocence, it is a sign of something much deeper, the voice of the collective unconscious speaking to us through story. For Jung, fairy tales and myths were never just entertainment. They were living maps of the human soul. Every archetype, every universal character pattern, speaks directly to an inner truth we carry within us. The prince searching for his kingdom is not just a fictional figure, but a reflection of our striving spirit. The witch, with her dark spells and jealous wrath, reveals our hidden shadow, the parts of ourselves we wish to deny. The dragon, with its scales and fiery breath, is not only a beast, but also the obstacle each one of us must face in the depths of our own psyche. And the princess, often trapped, silenced, or forgotten, becomes the image of the self longing to awaken. Perhaps this is why, even as adults, when we hear these stories again, they don't feel childish or distant. Instead, they strike us as strangely familiar, as if they are whispering about our own lives in disguise. Jung explained that fairy tales carry fragments of the collective unconscious, the vast reservoir of images, memories, and symbols that belong to humanity as a whole. Unlike dreams, which are tied to the individual, fairy tales come to us purified, stripped of personal detail, and distilled into archetypal form. That is why people from different cultures, times, and languages can listen to the same tale and feel it resonate. The story of Cinderella in Europe has echoes in the tales of Ye Xian in China or Tam Cam in Vietnam. Each culture clothes the story in its own colors, but the archetype remains unchanged. The neglected one who rises, the ashes that give birth to radiance. As you listen to these words, you may find yourself asking, what role do fairy tales still play in your life? Do you see yourself as the hero, bravely venturing out to face uncertainty? Or do you sometimes feel like Cinderella, waiting for your moment to rise from the shadows into your true place? These questions are not abstract. They are invitations to self-recognition. Jung believed that when we engage with myth and story, we are not only entertained, we are drawn into a mirror that reflects our own inner journey. Imagine again that moment in childhood. You are sitting by the fire, or perhaps on the floor of a modest home, with a loved one telling you a tale. You may not remember every word, but you remember the feeling, the wonder, the unease, the hope. That memory lingers not because it was just a sweet ritual, but because the story carried something ancient that your soul already knew. And even now, decades later, those same symbols still move you because they bypass the intellect and speak directly to the psyche. Jung once remarked that fairy tales are the purest and simplest expressions of the collective unconscious. They are like distilled dreams of humanity, stripped of unnecessary detail and offered in timeless form. In a dream, our unconscious uses the people and places of our daily life, but in a fairy tale, it speaks in symbols anyone can understand. That is why, even across cultures, we see recurring figures: the wise old man, the trickster, the dark mother, the noble hero, the maiden of light. Each of these figures is not bound to one culture. but as a universal image rising from the depths of human experience. So the next time you hear the story of Snow White, do not dismiss it as something for children. Ask yourself, why does the image of a young woman in eternal sleep, waiting for a kiss, stir something so profound? Why does the jealousy of the queen, gazing into her mirror, feel strangely familiar? These are not just characters on a page. They are reflections of battles within us, between vanity and innocence, between shadow and purity, between death and rebirth. And here, at the beginning of our journey together, I invite you to pause and reflect. What fairy tale has always stayed with you? Which character haunts your imagination even now? Share it in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, what time of day it is, and which childhood story still lingers in your mind. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Carl Jung's Stories Unveiled and turn on notifications so you won't miss the rest of this journey through Jung's vision of myth and story. Because as Jung would remind us, fairy tales are not relics of a past age. They are living voices of our inner world. They endure because they belong to us all. They endure because deep down, we recognize ourselves in them. And they endure because within each tale lies the eternal struggle between darkness and light, between fear and courage, between the broken and the whole. In the sections that follow, we will look more closely at how these archetypes unfold. We will walk with Cinderella through the ashes, face the queen's shadow in Snow White, and confront the dragons that guard the thresholds of transformation. With each step, we will discover not only the stories of old, but the stories we are living now. Cinderella's story has been told and retold for centuries, across cultures and generations. Yet beneath the gowns, the glass slipper, and the glitter of a royal ball, Jung would see something far deeper than a simple rags to riches fantasy. He would see the image of individuation, the central process of becoming whole, the unfolding of the self. For Jung, individuation is not about becoming perfect or gaining status. It is about integrating the forgotten and wounded parts of ourselves so that we may live fully. In Cinderella, this archetypal journey is laid out with astonishing clarity, hidden in the fabric of a tale meant for children, but carrying the weight of profound psychological truth. Think of the ashes. Cinderella, stripped of her place, forced into humiliation, sits by the hearth covered in soot. She is unseen, undervalued, pushed aside by her stepfamily. To the conscious mind, this may appear as cruelty or injustice, but to the unconscious, it is an image of descent, a necessary stage in which the ego is humbled, broken down, and purified. In many cultures, ashes symbolize transformation, the residue of fire that consumes and yet makes room for renewal. For Jung, this is the first step of individuation. The ego learns it cannot control everything. The ashes mark the death of pride and the beginning of openness to something greater. Then comes the call. In the tale, the call is a royal invitation to the ball, a chance to step out of the shadows. Yet Jung would remind us that the ball is not only a party, it is the encounter with destiny, the confrontation with one's own potential. But how can Cinderella, covered in soot and mocked by those around her, ever hope to enter such a realm? This is where the archetype of the helper appears. In some versions, it is a fairy godmother. In others, it is the spirit of her dead mother or a magical tree. Whatever its form, this helper is the symbol of inner guidance, the transcendent function of the psyche that emerges when ego and unconscious begin to work together. Jung saw such moments in dreams. When the conscious mind is at its limit, something beyond the ego offers aid. In Cinderella, this aid comes as magic. The gown, the carriage, the slippers. Yet the real magic is the psyche's own capacity to rise when all seems lost. The ball itself is no mere dance. It is the encounter with the self, the greater wholeness beyond the limited ego. The prince, often misunderstood as a romantic partner alone, is the symbol of union with the self. He sees in Cinderella what others cannot, her true essence, her inner radiance, the spark of individuality that has been hidden beneath ashes and neglect. The glass slipper, fragile yet perfectly fitted, becomes the token of individuation itself, the unique path of the soul that no one else can walk. For Jung, the self is always both fragile and eternal, both vulnerable and indestructible. The slipper is delicate, but no other foot can fill it. It belongs only to Cinderella, just as each person has a singular destiny of becoming whole. You may find yourself wondering, why does this story, so simple, so filled with familiar images, move us so deeply? Perhaps because we too have known the ashes. We too have felt overlooked, diminished, or pushed into the background of our own lives. And perhaps we too have longed for the moment when the truth of who we are is finally seen, when the slipper finally fits. Jung believed that when we resonate with such stories, it is because they touch the archetypes within us. We are not only listening to Cinderella's story, we are listening to our own. Notice also the cruelty of the stepsisters and the indifference of the stepmother. They are not merely villains. They are the voices of envy, resentment, and judgment that live within us. They represent those parts of the psyche that would keep us small, that would whisper, "You are not enough." Jung would see them as shadows of the feminine, the distorted aspects of care turned into oppression. They remind us that individuation always requires struggle against inner opposition. No soul rises without resistance, and yet, the story is not bitter. It is filled with hope. For just when all seems impossible, help comes. Just when ashes seem final, the self breaks through. This pattern, Jung explained, is not confined to tales. It is the very rhythm of psychological growth. We fall, we despair, we are humbled, and then, out of the depths, something unexpected lifts us. It may come as a dream, a sudden intuition, or the kindness of another. It may come as the strength we did not know we had. The fairy godmother is real, not as a woman with a wand, but as the symbolic image of the psyche's healing force. If you reflect on your own life, can you see moments when you were in ashes, only to be lifted by a force beyond yourself? Perhaps you faced failure, grief, or loneliness, and yet out of that place, something began to change. That is the story of Cinderella alive within you. It is not about castles and balls, but about the possibility of transformation hidden in every human heart. As Jung wrote, the self is not given once for all. It must be discovered again and again, in each trial, in each descent into ashes, in each step of courage toward the unknown. Cinderella's slipper may be fragile, but it is unbreakable in its meaning. It tells us that each soul has a path, and when the time is right, that path cannot be denied. So when you hear Cinderella's story again, do not think of it as childish. Think of it as a map. It shows you how the psyche moves, from humiliation to recognition, from ashes to light, from fragmentation to wholeness. This is why Jung considered such tales essential, not trivial. They tell us who we are and who we might yet become. And as we step forward, we leave Cinderella at the palace doors, her slipper fitted, her self revealed. But our journey is not over. For another tale, darker and more complex, awaits us. The story of Snow White, where the shadow appears in full force. and the struggle between innocence and envy unfolds with unflinching clarity. Snow White's story carries with it a very different tone than Cinderella's. Where Cinderella is a tale of hope rising from despair, Snow White is a tale of innocence threatened by jealousy, of purity overshadowed by darkness. Yet Jung would insist that both tales are windows into the psyche, and each carries lessons for the inner life. If Cinderella reveals individuation through transformation, Snow White exposes the reality of the shadow, the hidden, denied aspects of the self that seek expression whether we want them to or not. Think first of the queen, standing before her mirror. Day after day she asks, "Who is the fairest of them all?" This question is not merely vanity, it is the cry of the ego desperate to remain supreme. For Jung, the queen embodies the shadow of the feminine, envy, competition, and the refusal to yield space to the new. She is the darker side of the mother archetype, the one who devours instead of nurtures. In the natural cycle of life, youth must eventually rise, innocence must grow into maturity, and new generations must step forward. Yet the queen cannot allow this. Her envy will not permit Snow White's beauty to flourish, and so she turns to destruction. This is how the shadow behaves in us. When a new possibility begins to emerge within our psyche, the old ego resists, sometimes fiercely, seeking to smother it. Snow White, on the other hand, is innocence incarnate. She is purity, untouched and fragile. But innocence alone is not safe in the world. It is easily preyed upon. Jung would say that Snow White represents the emerging self, the potential of wholeness, still unconscious and unformed. That is why she must fall into her deep sleep, because the self cannot awaken without passing through death-like transformation. Her journey reminds us that purity is never enough by itself. It must be tested, hidden, and reborn. And what of the seven dwarfs? They are curious figures, often reduced to comic relief in modern retellings, but to Jung they are profound. Each dwarf can be seen as a fragment of the psyche, the many small aspects of ourselves that labor in obscurity. They live in the earth, mining for jewels, a striking image of the unconscious, which toils beneath the surface, bringing forth treasures from the dark. Snow White's refuge with the dwarfs is symbolic. The self, in its vulnerable state, hides among the lesser aspects of the psyche until it is ready to fully emerge. Just as we sometimes retreat inward, letting small routines and hidden strengths sustain us, so too does Snow White retreat among her seven protectors. The poisoned apple is another crucial image. Half red, half white, it is beauty laced with danger. The queen, disguised, offers it, and Snow White accepts. This is the encounter with the shadow in its most seductive form. The apple represents the union of opposites, life and death, sweetness and poison, innocence and danger. Jung would interpret this as the psyche's confrontation with contradiction. We cannot reach wholeness by denying darkness. We must taste it, even suffer it, in order to awaken. Snow White's collapse is not a failure, it is initiation. Through her apparent death, she enters the deep unconscious, waiting for renewal. And here comes the most haunting image of all, the glass coffin. Snow White lies in it, preserved, untouched, seemingly lifeless. To Jung, this is the symbol of suspended transformation, when the self rests in potential, awaiting the right moment to awaken. How many of us have felt frozen at times in our lives, stuck between what has ended and what has not yet begun? The glass coffin reflects that state. We are visible, we are seen, but we cannot yet move. The psyche is waiting, gestating, until the right touch calls it forth. The prince's kiss is often misunderstood as mere romance. But to Jung, it is not about a man saving a woman. It is the spark of consciousness awakening the self. It is the moment when potential stirs into actuality, when the slumbering truth within us is finally quickened by awareness. The kiss is symbolic of integration, the coming together of conscious and unconscious, life and death, shadow and light. Snow White awakens not because of external rescue, but because the time of transformation has ripened. If you look within your own experience, you may recall moments of being like Snow White, trapped by the jealousy or opposition of others, poisoned by disappointment, or frozen in waiting. Perhaps you have known the feeling of lying in the glass coffin of your own psyche, seen but unable to act, yearning for something to awaken you. Jung would say that this is not failure. It is part of the cycle of growth. Just as Snow White must die to her innocence in order to awaken into maturity, we too must pass through periods of stillness, darkness, or shadow in order to become whole. The queen's repeated disguises, first as a peddler with laces, then with a comb, finally with the apple, also reveal how the shadow never comes in one form. It shifts, it hides, it tempts. In our lives, the shadow may appear as envy, as anger, as self-doubt. It may wear the face of others who seem to oppose us, but often it is our own inner saboteur. Jung believed that only by recognizing these disguises can we hope to integrate the shadow, to prevent it from destroying what is most vital within us. Snow White's tale is darker than Cinderella's, but no less essential. It tells us that innocence alone cannot survive. It must pass through trial, death, and rebirth. It tells us that the shadow cannot be ignored. It must be faced, even tasted, before the self can awaken. And it tells us that deep within, even when we feel trapped in glass coffins of our own making, there is always the possibility of renewal. As we leave Snow White, awakened and alive, the queen destroyed by her own envy, we see the balance restored. But Jung would caution us. The shadow is never gone forever. It will return in new forms, in new disguises. The work of individuation is ongoing, and the tales remind us that each victory is but a stage in a lifelong journey. Now, with both Cinderella and Snow White before us, we can begin to see the pattern more clearly. Descent, trial, death, renewal. This rhythm runs through countless myths and legends, and nowhere is it clearer than in the tales of dragons and heroes. These monsters and quests, so ancient and so universal, are not only stories of adventure, they are the symbols of the trials that guard the thresholds of our own transformation. The image of a dragon crouching at the threshold of treasure is one of the most enduring symbols across human cultures. From the fire-breathing beasts of European legend to the serpentine guardians of Asia, dragons appear wherever humans have told stories. To the surface mind, they are monsters to be feared or slain. But to Jung, dragons are symbols of the inner trials that guard every step of transformation. They embody the chaos, fear, and resistance that stand between us and the deeper treasures of the self. The hero's battle with the dragon is not simply a tale of violence and conquest. It is a map of psychological struggle, of the confrontation with what we most dread within ourselves. Consider the stories. St. George piercing the dragon with his spear, Sigurd slaying Fafnir to win wisdom, or even the unnamed knight who must pass the beast to free a captive maiden. In each case, the dragon is more than an enemy. It is the embodiment of greed, rage, primal force, or unintegrated shadow. The treasure it guards is always symbolic: gold, wisdom, freedom, or love. And the lesson is always the same. To gain what is most valuable, one must face the monster within. Jung often emphasized that the unconscious is not merely a storehouse of forgotten memories. It is alive with both creative and destructive power. When left unacknowledged, the unconscious becomes a dragon, terrifying, overwhelming, threatening to consume us. This is why, in myth, the dragon so often guards treasure. The very things we long for most, wholeness, meaning, freedom, are hidden behind the terror of confronting what we would rather avoid. And yet, the hero is not only someone else. The hero is each of us. Every time we confront a fear, every time we dare to enter a dark place within ourselves, we enact the hero's journey. The dragon takes many forms. For some, it is anxiety, rising like fire in the chest. For others, it is addiction, coiled tightly, refusing to release. For still others, it is grief, heavy and suffocating, guarding the gate to healing. Jung would say that unless we face these dragons, the treasure remains locked away. Notice also how the hero never wins by chance. In the old tales, the hero must prepare, often guided by wisdom. An old man, a magical sword, or a dream of what must be done. This guidance, Jung explained, is the archetype of the wise old man or the transcendent function of the psyche itself. It is the part of us that whispers insight just when we need it most, the intuition that reveals a path when reason fails. In dreams, such guidance appears as symbols, mentors, or inner voices. Just as the fairy godmother aids Cinderella, so too does the wise figure equip the hero for the dragon's lair. But there is another side. Sometimes the hero does not kill the dragon, but befriends it, learns from it, or even absorbs its strength. In this way, the dragon becomes not only the obstacle, but also the source of power. Jung would call this integration. The dark forces of the psyche, once acknowledged, no longer need to terrorize us. They can be harnessed as energy for growth. Anger becomes courage. Fear becomes awareness. Grief becomes compassion. In this way, the dragon is not destroyed, but transformed. The princess, so often rescued from the dragon, is also more than a helpless figure. She symbolizes the imprisoned self, the part of us waiting for release. She is the soul's radiance, hidden behind the coils of fear and shadow. When the hero slays or integrates the dragon, the maiden is freed. This is not about romance. It is about inner union. The hero and the princess together represent the conscious and unconscious joining to form wholeness. Perhaps you can remember a dragon of your own, a time when you stood before something that felt overwhelming, impossible, larger than life. Did you face it? Did you retreat? Did you perhaps, in time, find that what once terrified you became a source of strength? Jung would remind us that these stories endure because they are our stories. Each dragon is personal, and each treasure is unique, but the pattern remains universal. The tale of the dragon is also a tale of rebirth. To face the monster is to die, symbolically. The hero descends into the lair, into the darkness, often believed lost. But when the dragon falls, the hero emerges not the same as before. This is the death and resurrection motif, present in myth after myth. Osiris torn apart and reassembled, Christ descending to the underworld before rising, countless heroes passing through death to reach life anew. Jung saw in these patterns the psyche's deep knowledge. No transformation comes without symbolic death. And so, dragons are not only enemies, they are teachers. They force us to grow, to sharpen our courage, to awaken strengths we did not know we had. Without the dragon, the hero would remain untested. Without fear, there would be no courage. Without dissent, there would be no rising. As you reflect on this, Ask yourself, what dragon guards your treasure today? Is it an external challenge? Or is it a voice within, whispering doubt or fear? And if you were to face it, what treasure might you discover waiting behind its fiery breath? We leave the dragon's cave knowing that struggle is inevitable, but also purposeful. For every story of beast and hero is a reminder that trials shape us. They carve us into beings capable of carrying light. And as we turn from dragons and beasts, we encounter another theme just as profound: the balance of the masculine and the feminine, the archetypal union of anima and animus, without which no soul can find its wholeness. Why do fairy tales and myths continue to touch us even as adults? Why, after we have left behind the bedtime rituals of childhood, do we still feel stirred when we encounter a story of a brave hero, a cursed maiden, or a miraculous transformation? Carl Jung believed the answer lay in the deepest layers of the psyche. Fairy tales are not only for children. They are distilled expressions of the collective unconscious, and so they reach us at every stage of life. What we hear as children entertains us, but what we rediscover as adults awakens us. Consider how often adults return to these stories. We read them to our children, watch them in films, or even dream in images that echo their plots. When Disney remakes a tale, millions watch, not only children. There is something timeless in these images that speaks to us, regardless of age. Jung would explain that fairy tales and myths are archetypal dramas, universal stories that mirror inner psychological truths. Even if we forget the exact words, the essence lingers. The moment when good confronts evil, when innocence triumphs, when transformation becomes possible. These are not just entertainments, they are mirrors. As adults, our relationship to fairy tales changes. What once felt magical now feels symbolic. The stepsisters who torment Cinderella become recognizable as the voices of envy or self-doubt within us. The dragon that blocks the hero's path is no longer only a monster, but the embodiment of fear, addiction, or grief in our own lives. The kiss that awakens Snow White resonates as a metaphor for consciousness, touching the deepest places of our being. In this way, the tales grow with us, their symbols adapting to each stage of our development. Jung often pointed out that myths and fairy tales carry truths that logic alone cannot express. They speak in symbols, in images that bypass intellect and touch the soul directly. Adults, often weighed down by the rational demands of life, need these stories more than ever. They remind us of wonder. They reconnect us to the unconscious currents that guide our lives, often silently. When we listen to a myth, we are reminded that our struggles are not meaningless, but part of a pattern as old as humanity. Why else would so many people, in their 30s, 40s, and beyond, still turn to tales of heroes and quests? Because these stories articulate what we are living, often without realizing it. The job change, the loss of a loved one, the search for meaning, the confrontation with fear. All of these are dragon-slaying moments, journeys through the ashes, battles with the shadow. Even if we never call them by such names, we recognize their rhythm in the old stories. There is also comfort in the familiarity of myth. Life as an adult often feels chaotic, unpredictable, even meaningless. Yet fairy tales assure us that chaos has form, that darkness has purpose, that even the most hopeless situation may hold a hidden path forward. Think of the countless tales where the hero is abandoned, mocked, or imprisoned, only to rise stronger in the end. These images reassure us that our hardships, too, may contain seeds of transformation. Jung also used these stories therapeutically. In his work with patients, he often turned to myths and fairy tales as mirrors of the psyche. When someone struggled to articulate their pain, a story could provide the symbol. If a patient felt trapped, Jung might recall a tale of imprisonment and release. If they felt overwhelmed by envy, he might speak of the queen who could not endure Snow White's beauty. In this way, stories served as bridges between the conscious and unconscious, giving shape to what could not yet be spoken. For adults, this is perhaps the greatest gift of fairy tales. They remind us that we are not alone. Our struggles are not unique, but shared across humanity. When you feel envy, you are not the first. It has been told in countless tales. When you feel despair, you are not the first. It too has been woven into story. The archetypes remind us that what we experience has meaning, even when it feels unbearable. Think of your own life. Do you ever feel, even now, the pull of a childhood story? Perhaps a moment when you are tired, and suddenly an image from long ago comes to mind. The slipper, the poisoned apple, the dragon. Do you ever sense that these images still live within you, waiting to remind you that your life, too, is a story unfolding? Jung believed that adults need these reminders precisely because we forget. We bury ourselves in duties and expectations, losing touch with the archetypal patterns that animate our being. Fairy tales and myths break through that forgetfulness. They invite us back to the eternal language of the soul. They awaken wonder, humility, and the courage to face what lies ahead. So, when you next hear a fairy tale, whether in a book, a film, or told by the voice of a child, do not dismiss it as mere nostalgia. Listen closely. Beneath the surface, it is speaking directly to you, to the part of you that still longs for meaning, courage, and transformation. That longing does not vanish with age. If anything, it grows stronger, and the old stories become truer. And as we prepare to take the final step of our journey, we see how Jung himself turned to myths and fairy tales in therapy. For him, they were not distant relics, but living tools of healing, guiding souls through the labyrinth of the unconscious toward integration. It is there, in the work of therapy, that the old stories reveal their most practical power. When Carl Jung sat with his patients, he often found that the language of logic was not enough. People came burdened with grief, anxiety, envy, or despair, states of mind that could not easily be explained away. To tell them be rational was meaningless, because their suffering came not from reason, but from the depths of the unconscious. And so Jung turned to symbols, myths, and fairy tales as mirrors of the soul. For him, these stories were not entertainment. They were keys to healing. They gave shape to the hidden dynamics of the psyche and offered a way for individuals to see themselves more clearly. Imagine a patient who feels crushed by jealousy. She cannot admit it, for envy feels shameful, yet it consumes her. Jung might point her towards Snow White's evil queen, gazing into her mirror, consumed by envy of youth and beauty. In this tale, the patient recognizes her own inner queen, not as condemnation, but as symbol. She learns that envy is part of the shadow, a force that must be acknowledged if it is ever to be integrated. Suddenly, her experience is not only personal, but archetypal. She is not merely flawed, she is part of the universal human drama. This recognition begins the healing. Or think of a man paralyzed by despair, unable to see meaning in his life. Jung might draw his attention to Cinderella in the ashes, humiliated and forgotten, yet on the edge of transformation. The image of sitting in soot becomes a mirror of his own psyche. What feels like meaningless suffering may in fact be the first step of individuation, the descent before the rise. By seeing himself in Cinderella's story, the patient can endure his present ashes with hope, knowing that this stage, too, has meaning. For Jung, therapy was not about giving answers, but about helping people find their own symbols. Fairy tales offered those symbols in distilled form. The archetypes, hero, maiden, shadow, wise old man, dragon, each represented energies alive within the psyche. To connect with them was to connect with the deeper patterns shaping one's life. A patient who dreamed of a beast might be encouraged to see it not only as fear, but as a dragon guarding treasure. A woman who dreamed of a wise figure might be guided to recognize the archetype of the inner guide. In this way, myth and therapy wove together, bridging the conscious and unconscious. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of using fairy tales in therapy was the sense of familiarity they gave. Many patients, Jung observed, felt isolated in their struggles. They believed their pain was uniquely theirs. Yet when their experiences were mirrored in a universal story, they felt less alone. To realize that others, across time and culture, had faced the same dragons, the same shadows, brought relief. Healing began in the recognition that one's suffering was part of something greater, a human inheritance shared by all. You may wonder, what about yourself? Have you ever faced a moment where a story gave you unexpected clarity? Perhaps a film, a novel, or even a childhood fairy tale suddenly spoke to your current life. In that moment, the story became more than fiction. It became a mirror. This is exactly what Jung meant. The unconscious speaks through images, and fairy tales are the purest images we have. They do not argue, they show. They do not lecture, they reveal. And in revelation, healing begins. Jung's method reminds us that transformation is not about discarding our darkness, but about integrating it. The evil queen is not destroyed forever, but recognized as part of the psyche. The dragon is not always slain, but sometimes befriended or absorbed. The maiden is not simply saved, but awakened into her own power. This is the process of individuation, the bringing together of opposites, the weaving of light and shadow into wholeness. Fairy tales, in their simplicity, enact this process again and again. And so, as adults, when we return to these stories, we are not regressing into childishness. We are engaging with some of the deepest truths of the human soul. We listen to them not because we believe in magic wands or talking animals, but because we know, at some level, that they describe our own inner journeys. We know that when we hear "Once Upon a Time," we are entering the landscape of our own unconscious, guided by symbols older than memory. Carl Jung's work with myths and fairy tales reminds us that every life is, in some sense, a story. Each of us plays roles, faces trials, encounters helpers, struggles with shadows, and seeks treasure. To see our life as story is to give it meaning, and to recognize that even suffering has a place in the larger arc. Fairy tales endure because they remind us of this truth. We are characters in a drama larger than ourselves. And as we close this exploration, let us return to where we began. The question of why we still love fairy tales. The answer, Jung would say, is simple. Because they are us. They are the language of our inner life, the mirror of our struggles, the guide to our healing. They endure not because they entertain, but because they reveal. Fairy tales and myths are not distant relics, nor are they the property of children alone. They are the eternal language of the psyche, the distilled wisdom of humanity, echoing through the ages. Carl Jung devoted his life to showing us that within these stories lie the archetypes that shape who we are. The shadow we fear, the self we seek, the hero we hope to become. When we listen to a fairy tale, something deep stirs within us. We recognize ourselves, even if only dimly. We recognize our struggles in Cinderella's ashes, our innocence in Snow White's sleep, our fears in the dragon's breath. And we recognize our potential in the moment of transformation, when what was hidden becomes revealed, when what was broken becomes whole. This is why, even as adults, we cannot let go of these stories. They are not escapism, but truth, told in the only language the unconscious fully understands. Symbol, image, archetype. They are the way the soul speaks to itself. And perhaps this is the greatest gift Jung offered us. The reminder that every life is a story, and that by attending to the symbols, we can read our own story more clearly. Therapy for Jung was not about fixing people, but about helping them listen to the story they were already living. In this way, healing came not from outside, but from within, from the recognition that even darkness carries meaning, and that every descent prepares the way for renewal. So as you finish listening, take a moment to ask yourself, what story are you living? Which archetype calls to you now? Are you in the ashes, waiting to rise? Are you asleep in the coffin of stillness, awaiting awakening? Are you facing a dragon, guarding the treasure of your next step? Wherever you are, know that the story is not over. The tale continues, and its meaning unfolds with you. Fairy tales endure because they are our shared inheritance. They remind us that we are never alone, that our struggles and triumphs echo those of countless generations before us. They whisper to us that life, for all its pain and mystery, is a meaningful journey toward wholeness. And so we love them, not because they are far from us, but because they are too close. They belong to us, and we to them. Deep down, we know that each of us is living a fairy tale, shaped by shadow and light, guided by symbols, moving always toward the self. Perhaps that is the final truth, that within each of us still lives a character waiting to emerge, a story waiting to be told. And when we listen to myths and fairy tales, we are, in fact, listening to the voice of our own soul.